Well, why don't I get started, and as people creep in, they can catch up. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial. My name is Daniel. I'm a curator of photographs, film and sound here, and it is my absolute pleasure today to spend the next half an hour with you watching cartoons, because it's the best thing one can say they did with their job. I went to work and I showed cartoons to people. I'm going to focus predominantly on material in our collection. I don't have enough time to tell you the whole story of animation and war, so I'm going to anchor in on the material we hold in the Memorials collection, and it's focused around the First and Second World War. There is the use of animation past that period in relation to wartime, but that is a bigger story for another day. Most of the content is Australian, but I do want to touch on some work done by allies, particularly the British and the Americans, partially because it links into the narrative, and partially because it's really entertaining to share. So, cartoons. The earliest recorded piece of animation is Matches and Appeal. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find a clip of it, so I only have this still. The images I've used throughout here have all been sourced from Wikimedia Commons, the ones that aren't from our collection. Matches and Appeal asked patriots in the audience to donate 1 guinea to enable the Bryant and May Match Company to send a free box of matches to every British soldier fighting in the Boer War. It's made by Arthur Melbourne Cooper, and his animation is quite literally a little stick figure, a little matchstick man held together with wire. He places him on a tiny stage, takes a shot, moves his arm, takes a shot, moves his arm another bit, and slowly but surely the little man comes to life. Stop motion animation. Have you ever seen Wallace and Gromit? It's the exact same logic. And in fact, up until the 1990s, most animation works on the same logic. Take a frame, move it slightly, take another one, with variations to a theme. It's the logic, as I described to a group yesterday, it's a flick book. It's how film works, it's how animation works. So he's got his little match man and he'd come out and he'd write his message. It would probably have screened before a newsreel to raise money. And what it highlights not only the beginning of how we do animation, but two of the main things animation gets used for: propaganda and advertising. It's an ad, and it's also raising awareness for the war effort. So, if we leap off from there and turn to the British, there's this very popular stage act from the 1900s onwards called the lightning sketch artist. What they would do is get up on stage like I am today with a big blackboard or whiteboard next to them, and without looking really quickly, draw a face or a figure or an animal. It's kind of Mr. Squiggle, just 60 years before. And they'd draw it, and then they'd rub it out, and they'd change it, and change where the arm is, and change where the face, and slowly but surely the picture would come to life for you. And very early on, in the early days of cinema, they realised this was a worthwhile thing to film. It'd make a good short film where you're doing my act. And there's a film called Humorous Funny Faces from 1906, and they were filming it happening, and then sometimes they'd stop the camera, and he'd put another line on, and then they'd start the camera again, and then they'd stop the camera and draw another arm, and there we have early animation, the same technique as our matchstick man, and the lightning sketch would come to life. So a lot of the early animation associated particularly with wartime is these lightning sketch artists transitioning into the animation field. So the British example I had for you was a guy called Lancelot Speed, which is probably the best name I've ever heard. And he initially was well known as a sketch artist. He also did Victorian illustrator of books using fantastical romantic nature. We've got one there from a Grimm's fairy tale. And then he transformed into a sketch artist. We've got a capture here of him doing his sketch art as it goes along. He did a number of them for the British wartime effort. He did a series called Bully Boy that sort of raised awareness of the efforts that the British population, what the British population could do. And his longest one, which you can watch in full on the British Pathé website, is called Britain's Effort. And it goes through all the things that British industry is doing and it animates them. So you can see without having to film the large technology of war or the masses, they just create them through drawings and lightning sketches. He also employs a cutout technique. So he goes a little bit further. He has his sketch and he makes a little paper doll. So a bit like our wooden man, and then he lies him flat on the page and he moves his arm as he needs to move them. And then when he wants to change the expression on a character's face, for example, takes off the head, puts on a new head with a different face on it, and so on. So the clip I want to show you is from one of his films that's in our collection called The YouTube. A YouTube without any cats playing piano, but a YouTube all the same. It's about 15 minutes long, so I'm just going to show you about 3 minutes of it. And the general premise is the Germans have a plan to tunnel to Britain, and they're going to build a device that they're going to get into, and it's going to get them to Britain, and they're going to win the war like that. But because this is British propaganda, they're silly Germans, it'll never work. So let's just watch the launch of the YouTube. And it's silent as well because of the error. And you can see in the way the figures move, that paper figurine that he describes using. And we see regularly that parody of the Iron Cross just being given out to everyone, mocking the German Valor Medal in that way. And it will play in to why the machine goes wrong shortly. So we can see it's no longer animation, it's literally the animator's hands coming into frame and filming it. And you would see that in that lightning sketch. Sometimes their hand would come on and draw part of the image, or in this case, use an iron cross to muck with the compass that is guiding them on their way. And you can see Lancelot Speed's emblem in the bottom corner of these frames. And there we are in Birmingham at last. Anyone familiar with the pioneer of science fiction, George Méliès, will see they're riffing on George Méliès' Voyage to the Moon as well, the spaceship that he animates in that. So, what about Australia? Well, Harry Julius is seen as the father of Australian animation. There is reference to Alec Lang, who was, again, a lightning sketch artist, doing animated lightning sketches in relation to the Boer War, but there is no image or record of them. So beyond that mention, we don't know what can be made of those. So we really do start our story with Harry Julius. He did his first public lightning sketch at the age of 9, apparently, and later he's trained in fine art in Sydney, and with Sydney Smith, he founds Smith and Julius advertising firm. They do political cartoons, satirical cartoons in the paper, and they turn their hand to advertising, again, building on the lightning cartoon, the lightning sketch style. Julius also patents the paper doll technique that we saw Lancelot Speed doing because no one had done it. And he said, well, no one else ties the bits together. Everyone else just lies them on top of each other, but I tie them together, and that's what's unique to my technique. So there's a patent standing in the period with Julius owning the technique. And he then manages to campaign to get himself a government gig working with the Australasian Gazette, promoting and satirising the war effort. He, in an article in the Adelaide Mail, it's described as thus: "Artist Harry Julius has just fixed up with the Australasian Film Company to supply movie cartoons for the Weekly Gazette. The class of picture has been extensively used in the United States and England, but Julius will supply the first Australian series to be shown. The audience sees the artist arrive on his studio, search the morning papers for a topic, then it observes him dash the paper down. After an enormous hand and pencil fill the screen, the cartoon is drawn on in an immense scale line drawing with uncanny rapidity." Again, they are parodies. This is a frame from one of his cartoons of the moment. You see it's parodying the enemy, it's dehumanising the enemy because that makes it easier in many ways. A number of his cartoons at the moment are held in the National Film and Sound Archive, and you can watch them on their website. They're great. The one we have, however, in the collection is actually a bit of an oddity. It isn't titled as a cartoon of the moment. It is working with Norman Lindsay's question mark poster. Lindsay did a lot of propaganda posters as a graphic designer during the First World War, and this poster in our collection, we have a series of them, was part of the final nationwide recruiting campaign in 1918. And this poster with the German beast of war spreading his gore across the world appeared overnight in capital cities. The posted on buildings. And then shortly after, this animated short, using the same techniques we've seen, was created by Harry Julius, bringing this monster to life. I know it sounds, so I'll screen it for you now. Again, it's silent. I know it sounds strange, but of the things I'm showing today, this is the one that I would give a PG rating. There is just something about it that's a little bit scary, so I would just warn you of that. And you can see in the way its hands move, he literally would have taken a shot and replaced the hands to give it that quite iconic action. And he's obviously used other elements of Lindsay's work because those female figures are very reminiscent of Lindsay paintings. And again, you see one of the Lindsay posters reused at the end of it. So let's now move on away from monsters of the First World War to the monsters of the Second. I'll talk about the Australian element momentarily, but I just want to touch on a few things from the big American producers of animation, Warner Brothers and Disney. Warner Brothers were not as prolific as Disney, but they are heavily involved in the animation, the use of animation propaganda and training in the Second World War for the Americans. They did do short propaganda cartoons that mocked the enemy, like some of the ones we saw in the First World War. The screen grab below is from the Ductators, in which the Hitler duck, the Mussolini duck, and the Hirohito duck take over the barnyard, but eventually lose to the good birds of peace. It's quite Orwellian in its Animal Farm feel in watching, and I recommend looking it up. But one of their main productions was Private Snafu, who was invented by Frank Capra, the film director. And he was created as a tool to help enlisted men that had weak literacy skills learn through animated cartoons. And it's got comic books that go with it as well. And it had simple language and it had some racy illustrations, but it did a lot of moralising, and Private Snafu does everything wrong. He shares secrets, he spreads diseases, he makes all the mistakes by not following military protocol. So we watch Private Snafu make mistakes and we learn from them. And apparently he was very popular. It was only ever screened to Defence Force. It wasn't a widely circulated thing. It was for them, particularly for this purpose. And the commentator, they are sound cartoons. When announcing them, he will tell you that SNAFU stands for Situation Normal, and it's all fouled up. And he was quite popular. But the cartoons weren't seen till long after the war because of the use. The other figure worth mentioning is Bugs Bunny. He doesn't play a large role in propaganda cartoons. They use made-up characters because after the war, a lot of the cartoons made by Disney and Warner Brothers, they put away in the vaults and didn't want them seen because they had racial slurs like the ones I put on the screen here. They had a tone that outside of wartime made people very uncomfortable. But Bugs Bunny did in the a 1943 short Super Rabbit, in which he's being Superman and he's fighting bad guys, and towards the end of it, there's more villains afoot, and he says, this needs a real hero. And he goes into a telephone booth, and he comes out, and he's not wearing a Superman outfit, he's wearing the uniform of the US Marine Corps. The US Marine Corps was so enamoured by this, they made him an honorary Marine. Bugs Bunny has the privilege of being the only animated character ever to become an honorary Marine. Bob Hope is an honorary Marine, a number of other actors, but he's the only animated character. Beyond this, throughout the rest of the war, he kept getting promoted. So when he retired at the end of the Second World War, Bugs Bunny is officially a Master Sergeant of the US Marine Corps. Anyway, so on to Walt Disney, who do huge amounts of work for the American propaganda machine. Both Walt Disney and Warner Brothers by this time are using what we call cell shading, cell-based animation, where it is, again, we're using a similar theme where we've got the background, and then on top of it we have, say, the body of our character, and then the arms will go on another transparent sheet on top of that, each one of them hand-painted, and so on and so forth. And as you need to change a movement, you replace the transparent sheet with the relevant piece. And in the cartoon we watch momentarily, you'll see that, in that the background is quite flat, and as you get, the more mobile pieces are more animated because they're changing them over quickly. And that technique is used for animated films until 1990, and then once computer animation, and computer animated techniques are being used for The Little Mermaid in 1989. That's no longer traditional hand-drawn cell animation. That is using some computer programs to do it. So it's as early as that it starts picking up the pace. But Disney, they think that almost 90% of Disney employees during the second half of the Second World War were making training and propaganda films for the government. They're not all animated. There's lots of live-action ones in there as well. But they reckon over 400,000 feet of educational war films, which is like 60 to 70 hours of footage generated by Disney for the American war effort. I also read a guy called Stephen Watts has done a sort of history of Walt Disney. And he makes the claim that Disney Studios is the only studio ever to be occupied during wartime. Allied forces, I suspect, but he says that The day after the Pearl Harbor attack, Walt Disney received an early morning call from his studio manager. "Walt, the army's moving in on us," the man said. They came up and said they wanted to move in, and I said, "I'd have to call you," and they said, "Call him, but we're moving in anyway." And with that, 500 US Army troops marched into Disney's studio. Part of the force was stationed in the hills around LA to protect aircraft factories, and then they used the soundstage to repair equipment, stored ammunition in the parking sheds, and posted guards in all the entrances, which is just something, an aside that I discovered while getting this talk together. But the most memorable figure of Disney's animation propaganda is Donald Duck. Donald Duck was chosen to be the face of the propaganda movement from Disney, and this was for two reasons. Partially because Donald Duck is impressionable. He has lessons to learn. It's the same thing we saw with Private Snafu. He's quick to temper. And it was also a very conscious decision from Disney not to use Mickey Mouse because of all the imagery coming out of the propaganda from Germany, equating the Jewish people of Europe with rodents, with rats and mice. And they just wanted to make a divide between where they were situating their message. The most famous outing is the Führer's face. Again, look it up. It is well worth watching, in which, in a fever dream, Donald Duck believes he is part of the Third Reich. But when he wakes up and realises he should give his war loans to the American war effort, he throws tomatoes in the Führer's face with a very catchy song. The animation even won an Oscar in 1943 for short animated film. After the war, it was put on a shelf and not seen till 2000 because they didn't like the imagery of Donald Duck dressed as a Nazi. Fortunately, I can't show it for you today. What I can show you is another one of the Donald Duck cartoons, Donald's Decision, in which he needs to make the right decision of what to do with his savings. It's a bit of an anomaly in the collection, as it comes from the Canadian from the Canadian film, the Canadian government, for the Australian audience using an American film. But I'll play it for you now. Oh, and we're in the sound era now, so you don't need my narration anymore.
Fighting men must have your help. They need more tanks, more planes, more guns, more shells. Never was the need more urgent. Invest in war saving certificates today.
Oh, that?
Yes, you. What would you be worth if the United Nations lost the war? Nothing. We must enlist in our army of regular war savers today.
Great stuff. I'm going to do it. Tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow.
Not tomorrow, Donald. Today.
Do it. I'm tired. Go!
Donald, your bank. Come along, Donald.
Wait a minute. Don't let that sap tell you how to spend your money. Be smart. Spend it on yourself.
Okay, I will.
Wait. In times like these, everyone must do his share.
That's right.
Don't listen to him. Go ahead, spend it. Have a good time.
First, you must defend the country that makes a good time possible.
Curses, he's too smart. I'll have to blitz him. Hey, look! Your petticoat's showing.
That's the last straw. You first, Donald.
If Donald can do it, why can't we? So finally, let's bring it back home to Australia, and the only animation company really operating during the Second World War is the Owen Brothers. And they are nowhere near the scale of Disney or Warner Brothers. They're living in, actual brothers living in Belgrave in Melbourne, and they have their own little cinema. They, in screening films before the war, they got very interested in the animated shorts they would screen from companies like Walt Disney and Warner Brothers, and would look at the film and literally nut out what we've been describing today, go, oh, if we do the picture and then we change it a bit, that's how we do animation. So they started up a small animation company doing a few things before the war, and then they realised there was most certainly a market for wartime animation. Dan Torres has done a lot of work on Australian animation, and he recounts in his book that in trying to get their gig for the war effort, what they did was animate the workings of a Lewis gun, the insides of it, and did a really accurate animation of how it worked to use as a training tool. And then they sent it to the printers to get developed. And when the printers saw it, it was so detailed they called the authorities. And the authorities showed up to ask them how they had this information, that you're revealing state secrets, and they said, we just looked at some pictures in a book that we got in the library and put it together. So they waived that one, but it got them the gig doing animation for the war effort. Predominantly they did shorts for victory loans, much like the Donald Duck one. And I'm going to share one of them with you now.
Buy the new 5-shilling war-saving stamp. We must have tanks.
And I believe that's how tanks are actually made during the war.
Lend that cash. We must have munitions. Lend all you can. Invest in the loan and back the attack.
My very final animation for you is probably my favourite film in the collection. This is the Squander Bug. He was created during the Second World War by a British artist, Philip Boydell, as an employee. He was an employee at the National Savings Committee. The committee was raising funds by urging the public to save their money and invest in the war effort, but they wanted to use a bit of reverse psychology. And if this villainous little guy told you to spend, maybe you wouldn't. He's represented a number of different ways by a number of different artists. Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, even does a version of the Squander Bug, and that wonderful object from the Imperial War Museum is him being used for target practice. But the only time the Squander Bug ever got to come to life in animated form is at the Owen Brothers cartoon that we have in our collection. And that's what I'd like to finish with today.
Make them waste their money. Make them spend. Go on. Spend all you can. Come on. It doesn't help the war effort a bit.
The alternate way to make a tank. That's about it from me. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to field them for you now. But if not, makes my job much easier. Andrew.
One of those said, made a reference to colour on the opening screen. Black and white.
Yes, the question was about the fact it made reference to it being colour. That Disney animation does exist in Technicolor. Colour film stock was a relatively precious commodity during the war, and I suspect the reason ours is black and white is the distributed ones outside the US were probably just done on black and white film stock. Yeah?
That was fascinating. I was wondering, I was particularly interested in the Lindsay animation, and as you all pointed out, it's silent. Is there any record of what the recommended accompanying piece would be for that? Because I can imagine it would have been very ominous.
The question was about what music might go with the Lindsay cartoon. Not that I've come across. I mean, it's hard to get a sense of even how they were received because the cartoons, the moment, and those shorts would go in front of going to an everyday picture. Now, the film screening might still be Heroes of the Dardanelles and be a recruitment-y sort of feature, but what goes with the short particularly, it's probably whoever is on the piano for the feature does something to go with it, I suspect. If that's all, thank you very much for your time, and you can buy your war saving certificates on your way out. Thank you.